Leg drive is arguably one of the more advanced techniques and skills within powerlifting. Many people are bench pressing for years and never truly master the ability to properly leg drive, and that includes myself. I've been bench pressing in some manner for probably 11 years now, powerlifting specific for over 5 years, and it probably wasn't until about 2 years ago I could really say like I understood leg drive and could really utilize it to maximize my bench press to the fullest. And part of that comes from just a misunderstanding, like a lot of things, with what is leg drive and what our legs are actually doing within the bench press. One of the main things is that leg drive is not necessarily propelling the bar or increasing our strength. It's more helping to create the tension and stability in position to allow us to express our strength to the fullest. If you were to bench press with your legs up, you feel the difference in stability. Or at least you should. If you don't, that goes back to probably some type of issue with not mastering your leg drive and utilizing it correctly. But the biggest single thing that leg drive is doing is helping us to stabilize and to create tension throughout our body to create the most optimal ability to transfer force from our body down through the bench, back up through the bar. Depending on the federation you compete in, there's different rules on what position your foot must be in. Within USA Powerlifting, your foot must be flat on the floor, whereas pretty much within any other federation, you can have your heel up. It just has to, so in some manner, the foot must be in contact, which usually means that most people are just going to kind of be on their toes. I personally, no matter what federation you compete in, strongly encourage most people to bench with their feet flat. I'm not going to say this is a one-size-fits-all, but I do think for the ability to learn how to properly leg drive, I do think it is optimal to bench with your feet flat. And this goes back to just general rules and ideas within sports. There isn't probably any other sport where you're going to argue that you're able to create better stability, better tension, and better force output by being on your toes. Almost every other aspect of sports, whether it's football, anything like that, you're going to want to maximize your connection with the floor. The more connection and surface area you are in contact with, the better you're able to stabilize and transmit force for the most part. And I believe the same goes for the bench press. When our feet are flat, we have a much better ability to control what our leg drive is doing. I think a lot of times people find benefit in going onto their toes because it creates a more just consistent forced leg drive without you having to even think about it, which I'll discuss a little bit later. Whereas with the feet flat, if you don't perform it right, you get pretty much zero leg drive. But if you do it right, it's kind of acting like a gas pedal. I'll use that analogy. When we're driving a car, we have a gas pedal that we can push to control what we're wanting to do. Versus just like a cruise control. We'll use it on your toes as a cruise control. You can't really control what you're doing, but at least it just gives you just a steady pace. Whereas having your feet flat allows you more to be able to have a greater control of what you're doing, a greater control of increasing leg drive, a greater control of producing more tension and stability, and a greater control of being able to improve position in reference for the rest of your body. Within this, I look at leg drive as our brace on bench press. When you think of squatting and deadlifting, I have another video where I talk greatly in detail about this within squatting, of how we brace and how we breathe, the Valsalva maneuver to create this intra-abdominal pressure. We don't really have that same type of brace on bench press because we're trying to work more in this extension-based pattern. We're lengthening our abdominals. It's a bit different. And our legs are really where that brace comes from. As I mentioned, it's to create stability and tension. That's the same thing we're doing when we're bracing on squat and deadlift. We're trying to create stability and tension within the bench press. We're using that through our legs, and it's creating this entire radiation effect from the legs through the upper body to really just tension everything from our head to our toe to create this kind of rock solid foundation to be able to transmit force to the bar. And as I've been talking about leg drive helping to create position, what that's really leading to, and what we're going to dive into later, is the ability to use leg drive to help elevate the rib cage to create a higher arch and more extension, which is also going to lead to just more natural shoulder depression and retraction from that created position. A lot of times too much we're trying to create this elevation by just our back, and if you're having consistent back cramps or you're just not able to get into that same arch position you want, it's probably because you're trying too much to do that from your torso and not enough of allowing your legs to create that position by this folding action into the bench. Two big misconceptions within leg drive that I do want to cover is the one that's probably the most prevalent is that leg drive is almost like a push press. I don't think anyone specifically says, oh, I want to push press the bar, but they get into this almost heave manner where they're letting go of leg tension and then they're really forcefully driving as they press. A lot of issues can arise from that. The biggest is just that we're just changing positions. We're going through this flexion and extension through our thoracic spine. That's changing our shoulder angle to our pectoral angle. We're changing tension throughout our body. It's just a dangerous way to do it, and it's too much of a technique that we rely on versus if we can just create a stable foundation through constant leg drive pressure, we're gonna find more consistency rep to rep, and as we're trying to produce more maximal force. The second big misconception that's maybe a little less prevalent than it used to be is that people used to really preach that we want to get our feet as far under us as possible. And that may work for some, but I kind of already touched on that prior, is that what that does is it more creates this kind of natural leg drive to where you think you're getting a good amount of leg drive, but really it's just because you're tucked so far under that your legs are forced to be under tension, and it creates this tension, but we can't control that tension. It's just there. We don't have this gas pedal effect where we can really change what we're wanting to do and change our position through leg drive. The second big issue with that is that typically, if we go too far under, and I'll kind of demonstrate this later, if we go too far under, it then changes the position of our torso. Our goal is to make that touch point of where our bar is touching the highest point of our torso. Most likely, if you're really pulling those feet under you, you're going to get to the point where I call it kind of the reverse J, to where we almost kind of want to create this J position, where from our head, we create this J going down to our body, with that highest point being our touch point. The issue with going way too far under is it creates the opposite J. Is here's our head to our torso. It's a straight line with kind of a flat upper back. Our belly button's the highest point, and then we wrap under us. And while it creates this feeling of tension, it creates unoptimal position for what we're trying to achieve within the bench press to, in a sense, decrease range of motion, as well as promoting shoulder retraction and depression. And then, as already mentioned, it's unoptimal for our ability to be able to understand how to control our leg drive throughout the movement. So getting in how to leg drive and how to optimize this, a couple things we need to understand first off. The number one thing is that leg drive is a constant tension throughout. The same leg drive we apply at the beginning is the same leg drive we are applying throughout the entire movement. It's not this release and drive, as I mentioned, with that kind of push press style leg drive. We want to create this constant tension. And that starts from the unrack. From the minute we unrack and get our setup, we're trying to already initiate that leg drive, and I'll get to that in just a second. The second thing we need to understand is leg drive is a horizontal force we're trying to create, not vertical. And that's going to touch on things we're going to talk about later of the issues of our butt popping up in the bench press. And that is mainly from people trying to get too much of a vertical force on the bench press. We want horizontal. We want to, in a sense, get ourselves sliding back onto the bench, which what that does, once we have this barbell loaded, we can't actually slide on this bench, especially if you have a good competition bench press that's sticky. You aren't going to slide into the bench. What's going to happen is your upper back, but more noticeably your upper traps, is going to get stuck onto that bench, and you're going to fold up onto it. And it's going to help to create that ribcage elevation and that retraction that we're really trying to look for. So the key here is that constant tension and being able to create that horizontal pressure through extending our legs out. So looking at what I mean by extending your legs out, the general thought process I have is that our feet, the pressure they're exerting is there's a slight downward pressure obviously, but we're trying to slide them out in a V pattern. They're going forward because that's how the quads are going to help to create that horizontal pressure. But I also say kind of in that V pattern because we want lateral pressure as well. That's going to help to create this lateral stability. While some people do a really good job and able to stabilize with their feet fairly close, I typically have most people have more of a wider base because not only do we want stability front to back, but we want it side to side as well. And being able to have that kind of V slide with the angle of how we're creating that leg drive is going to help not only create that horizontal drive back, but also that lateral drive to increase our side to side stability. So getting into the setup, one of the first big things everyone's going to wonder is where should my feet go? And I'm going to discuss further a little bit later some variations of this and how we might be able to change this. But for most people, my starting guide with where your feet are is we're gonna start with them actually too far out. And I'm gonna show you what we're gonna do to then figure out where our optimal foot position is. So we're gonna start with them a little bit too far out. I'm going to set up on the bench press, I'm going to grab the bar, and I'm really gonna use that bar to help me leverage. One big issue people have is they start too far away from the bar, where more of that bar is over their eyes and their forehead. We want that bar more over our chin and neck, so that we're almost already driving that bar up to push us and leverage us down into the bench so that we can really solidify our setup as we're unracking the bar. So I'm going to grab that bar, and I'm going to use my legs to extend onto my upper traps. You can see I'm extending my quadriceps to really roll onto my upper traps. From there, I'm going to walk back. And right there is where I can elevate my rib cage to the highest position. It's going to be very, very slight, so you might not be able to fully see this, but if you notice, at this point right here, this isn't as high. At this point right here, it's the highest, and if I keep going back again, it then starts to go down again. So my general thought process is that where you can create this highest rib cage position through this initial setup is where I'm going to have most people start with their starting position with where their feet are. So now that we've got a decent idea of where our foot position needs to be, let's now take that a step further with how we're going to unrack the bar. So I'm getting into position, I'm using that bar to help me leverage down into the bench. That bar is over my neck and my chin. I'm going to set on my upper traps. I'm going to extend with my quads, walk back a little bit until my rib cage is the highest. And right here, my hips come up because I'm driving down on the floor, but also because I am extending and sliding with my feet. And what I'm going to do is, as I'm in this position, I'm going to unrack, have that bar with my elbows locked, have that bar over my touch point with my shoulders retracted and depressed, and then I'm going to very slowly lower my hips. And as I lower my hips, what's happening there is an adjustment in the control of my leg drive. And this goes back to exactly why I think it's so important to have your feet flat and not so tucked under you, is what I'm doing there is my quad extension does not let go at all. Like in reality, I've had people do this and the next day, the first day they're really doing this right, their quads are sore from this. What I'm doing to lower my hips is I'm slightly letting off that hamstring and glute tension, because the hamstrings and glutes are what are extending the hips up. The quadriceps are what are creating that horizontal force back. So to lower down, I'm letting off that vertical tension. But I'm doing it very slow because the issue too many people have is they lower fast. And what happens is they let off the quad, or they let off the glutes and the hamstrings, which they should, but they also let off the quads. And I'll kind of demonstrate that. So we're set up, we're rolling onto those upper traps, we unrack, elbows locked, retract and depress our shoulders, and then I drop. And I drop too fast, you can even see my knees don't have any tension, my quads lost it, versus making sure that after I unrack, I continue the entire time to be feeling like I'm sliding my feet out as I slowly lower my hips down to allow that rib cage to stay elevated and to still be creating that constant sliding motion into the bench where I'm rolling up onto my traps. And you can almost think about, if you can get there, to almost get to the point where you're feeling how the skin on the back of your neck is starting to get stuck into that bench and starting to get traction as well. So now we've got our proper foot position. We understand that we need to create this leg drive from that initial unwrap and very slowly set our hips down so we don't lose that leg drive. But then we need to keep that throughout. So as I go to bench press, I need to remember all these things I've got during my setup. I'm going to unwrap, I'm on my quads, I slowly set my hips down, and then from there, I'm going to bench press while the entire time my legs are holding that same exact leg drive that I started with in the first place. Too often what I see, the number one thing I'm looking for a lot of times when someone's not utilizing leg drive is I see their knee, I look at their knee. If they're letting off leg drive, I'm going to see that travel forward as the bar comes down to their chest and then travel back again as they go to press, like this. How I can see the tension being let off my legs because that knee travels back, or travels forward, and then travels back again. We don't want that. We want that constant drive back. So what I cue to be able to try and keep that tension is, too often it's kind of a cue that goes back, is people say, almost kind of row the bar to you or feel your lats pull the bar into you. I don't want anyone to think about pulling the bar to them, because too often what pulling the bar into you means is they pull in and then they get into this collapse of the chest because they're constantly thinking about pulling the bar to them. I don't want to do that. I want to use my legs to drive so hard that my rib cage elevates to the point where it stops the bar. I want to think about driving that up. You can kind of see when I set up, from my knees to my sternum is almost a straight line, and I'm trying to drive that line up to stop the bar from going down. I'm lowering the bar to me, and I'm reaching that rib cage and sternum up to stop the bar. So this is what that looks like. Leg drive is full go. I slowly lower my hips. I come down. I almost feel like I'm increasing leg drive to stop the bar and then press up. Because right here, I can let go of the bar, and I am going to allow that bar to stay stable on my chest because my leg drive is holding me up. It's creating that strong brace position, versus if I'm not on my legs, what's going to happen is if I was to fully let go of that bar, I let go of my legs, that bar is going to sink, my chest is going to collapse down. So I'm really thinking about constantly driving those legs up to stop the bar, so it creates this super solid shelf, so that bar can't sink at all. It's just going to stop it right there, allow me to have that strong, steady pause so I can get that press command as soon as possible to then drive through. So looking at that setup, that's the general foundation I'm going to start most people at. That gives a decent idea of how to utilize leg drive, how to find your foot position, and how to create the best tension and stability, as while at the same time creating that leg drive to really elevate that rib cage and create that solid shelf to pause on. But not everyone's going to have the same bench press. They have different leverages, they have different styles and techniques. So there's different things we can do that are going to kind of change our ability and differences of how to create leg drive to optimize for ourselves. And one way is through changes in our foot position. I do want to cover the one issue with foot position first, and that is what I mentioned earlier with bringing your feet too far under you. And I'm going to kind of demonstrate that right now with kind of the excessive feet under, where you're really on your toes. So I'm going to show my setup first, like normal. Get on my upper traps, extend my quads, raise my hips, unrack, elbows locked, retract, hips down slowly. As you can see here, the highest point is that sternum, exactly where I'm going to touch. I'm creating the highest point to decrease true range of motion of where that bar is going to go. The opposite, and the issue where I see the feet coming back too far, is, like I said, it creates the reverse J curve. So if I really tuck my feet under, and I get in position, the highest point right now is my belly button. But that does nothing for me. My belly button is in no way involved with where that bar is going to touch. So I just sank my chest down, creating more range of motion. And I also limited the ability for my shoulders to retract and to press on the bench because I was more flat back. In reality, at that point, there wasn't much point of trying to create an arch. Like you think you have an arch because you can see some space between your back and the bench, but really you don't. It's more of just kind of a useless position, just creating a false sense of leg drive, because when our feet are really tucked under us, it traps them there. It's almost like this force pushing against us. So it creates a sense of tension, but it doesn't create a sense of ability of controlling that tension or being able to use that tension to optimize position. That's why I tend to prefer that flat foot position and having my feet a little further out. But now there needs to be some sort of range of, okay, do I have my feet even further out or maybe even slightly back? So looking at the option of our feet either being further out or a little bit further back, there's two big things that go into this. The first one is that the understanding that the farther our feet are forward and out, the more we're relying on a quad dominant extension to create that tension. The more they are back, the more we're relying on more of a glute and hamstring dominant tension to create more vertical drive. And it can go either way of what we need, but it's kind of dependent on what the lifter is struggling with. If the lifter is really struggling with this horizontal tension, we may have that feet a little further out to really force that more quad dominant leg drive. As well as a simple trick too is what type of shoes you wear. So if I'm on flat soled shoes, I might have, in my opinion, so this is kind of go back to keeping your butt down, which I'm going to talk back later. I use flat-soled shoes because I have extremely long tibias and I need to create the highest effective distance from my heel to the bench. For people who may not have that issue, a lot find benefit in using their squat shoes because of that slight heel lift. It really forces more quad dominance. It makes you be able to feel your quads more extending. So a lot of times they'll find benefit in that, as well as with the heeled shoe. If you like to, even the opposite, you like to have your feet tucked back a little bit more, it gives you more ankle dorsiflexion to be able to allow more range of motion to keep your foot still flat. So shoe choice is kind of dependent. I would typically say if someone has the ability to, without their butt coming up, a lot of people tend to have a lot of benefit with a heeled shoe. The downside is, one, if you struggle with your butt coming up due to certain leverages, or you struggle with your feet sliding. Because one issue with most squat shoes is they're not made to be super sticky to the floor, because they're not meant to slide around. They're meant for squatting, which is stable. On bench press, if you're having your feet fairly far out, they're probably going to have a decently hard time slipping, so a lot of people will go to those more flat-soled, stickier shoes. A lot of times there's notorious lift slippers. There's those one kung fu shoes that some of you have probably seen that have this super high grip sole. It's just really going to be dependent on what you need. So your foot position, as I mentioned, can dictate kind of the quad dominance, which is the horizontal drive versus the vertical drive, and it's really just kind of finding a happy medium. There isn't a right and wrong. I think there's a general way, as I showed, to kind of find your initial starting point, and then from there it's just playing with it. The second thing you can start to manipulate is stance width, and that can be to increase lateral stability based on kind of how you're feeling side to side. And second is going to our final point, is what if you struggle with keeping your butt down? First and foremost, the number one reason your butt will come up is because you are changing the extent of your leg drive throughout the movement. If you are letting off your leg drive and then trying to do that push press style, you are going to have your butt have to drive up, and you're going to see this difference because you're going through this change in tension. If you are creating constant leg drive, the likelihood of your butt coming up, since you're never changing what the lower extremities are doing, is very low. But even within that, there's still things that we can do to kind of help to decrease the likelihood of your butt coming up. One is, like I mentioned, is increasing the effective height from your heel to the bench, which for me is to be using flat-soled shoes. That makes now the sense of where the heel is touching to the floor, to the top of the bench, to be a bit higher versus if I was to use a squat shoe. The second way is through our stance width. If we are going wider, we are also effectively increasing our height to the bench because we're now lowering our center of gravity in essence by having a wider stable base. And then the third way is by having our legs further out. So if we have a fairly wide stance with our legs out, I'm going to show you here. So if I have a fairly wide stance with my legs out, and I go to bench press, it's very hard for me to lift my butt. It's possible, but it's still hard. And the reason why is we're creating more of a straight line from our knee to our rib cage. If you're seeing this kind of angle, and I'll kind of show this here. So if you see this right here, there is an obvious angle at where my hip is. That means I'm not maximizing my hip extension, so I can lift my hips up. The more I can create a straight line from my knee, through my hips, to my rib cage, the more that means that I'm actually at my full range of hip extension in my initial setup. Now, I think that's a fairly advanced technique to be having your feet that far out. I'm not going to recommend that for everyone. So usually the three things I'm going to recommend first is, one, flat-soled shoes to increase your height from the heel to the top of the bench. I'm going to have them increase their stance width, but more than anything, we have to keep on that constant leg drive. If we're doing that, our butt shouldn't be moving. If we're constantly driving with those quads that create horizontal force to slide back into the bench, our butt's not going to come up because we're not changing anything with how we're with what we're doing with our hip extension. We've set that, we have constant tension, and we're going to hold that throughout. It's almost kind of like comparing that with our squat. and what our pelvis is doing. If our pelvis is moving back and forth, that means we're not creating constant tension with our abdominals. We're letting that go and allowing it to lengthen throughout the movement. Even if we think we are, we're not, because we're allowing that change to happen. The same thing goes for bench press. If we have constant tension through our leg drive, our hips aren't going to move. So we really need to make that the foundation of keeping our butt down. Hopefully all of this gave you a better understanding of what leg drive truly is, which is a constant tension to create tension stability and improve our positioning within the bench press. When utilized correctly, it can be a great tool for optimizing our position and force output, but the issue is that most people really struggle to find context with what their legs are doing throughout the movement. And it really goes back to this thought that I would not like to think of this as a leg drive. It's more of a leg extension. A leg drive entails that we're driving through our legs. A leg extension is more of this extension of our quads and using kind of that V slide to create lateral pressure and horizontal force going back into the bench. So if you have any questions with this, feel free to leave some comments below and let me know what I might be able to help you with some individual aspects of this, of what you might be dealing with. And then make sure if you like this video, give it a like, comment, share, and subscribe to be able to pass the knowledge to others.